Hi, my name is Alex. Today I want to share a story that has been weighing heavily on my heart. It's not the easiest to talk about, but I think it's time to put it out there. This is the story of my marriage to Sarah, and how it all came crumbling down. It started innocently enough, like most love stories. I met Sarah 6 years ago at a friend's party. She was everything I had ever wanted. She had this amazing laugh that filled the room and eyes that sparkled with life. I was drawn to her energy, her spontaneity. She seemed like someone who embraced life wholeheartedly, and I couldn't resist getting to know her better. We hit it off almost instantly. Everything between us felt effortless. Conversations flowed like water, and we'd lose track of time when we were together. Within months, we were inseparable. I was convinced Sarah was the one. In retrospect, I guess I was blinded by love. Or maybe I just saw what I wanted to see. In the early days of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. We bought a small house together and settled into what felt like a dream life. We would wake up in the mornings, have coffee together, and talk about our future. We'd laugh, plan vacations, and talk about starting a family someday. But the truth is, perfection is fragile, and it didn't take long for cracks to show. At first, it was small things that you could easily brush off. Sarah started working late more often. She'd come home tired, barely speaking to me, and would go straight to bed. I didn't think much of it at first. I know work can be stressful, and I wanted to be a supportive husband. But then, she started canceling our weekend plans, saying she needed time to rest or catch up on some work. It was around that time I noticed her phone was always glued to her hand. She'd get messages at all hours of the day and night. When I asked her about it, she'd say it was just work. I believed her. I had no reason not to. But then, the distance between us grew. It felt like I was living with a stranger. We were in the same house, but emotionally, we were worlds apart. I remember one night, maybe a year into our marriage, I tried to talk to her. I wanted to know what was going on. I asked her, "Sarah, is everything okay between us? You seem distant." She looked at me, her face expressionless, and said, "Everything's fine, Alex. You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining things. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. I tried harder, planned surprise dinners, arranged weekend getaways, but nothing seemed to bring us back to where we were. It was as though Sarah had checked out emotionally, and no matter what I did, I couldn't reach her. As time went on, I started to feel like I was the only one trying. It was exhausting. There were days when I felt like I was walking on eggshells around her, afraid that if I said the wrong thing, it would push her further away. But the more I tried, the colder she became. Then came the lies. It started with little white lies. She'd tell me she was going out with friends, but when I called one of them to check in, they'd have no idea what I was talking about. Or she'd say she had to work late, but I'd drive by her office and the building would be dark. I didn't want to believe that Sarah was lying to me. I wanted to trust her. But the more it happened, the more obvious it became that something was seriously wrong. I confronted her one evening. "Sarah, I know you're not being honest with me. Where are you really going when you say you're working late? Who are you texting all the time?" She exploded. "How dare you accuse me of lying?" she shouted. I work hard to keep this house running, and this is how you repay me, by questioning my every move? I was stunned. I didn't expect her to get so defensive. But what hurt the most was the way she twisted it, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong, like I was paranoid for simply asking questions. After that fight, I felt more lost than ever. Was I really imagining things? Was I being unreasonable? But the truth has a way of surfacing even when you don't want to see it. One night, Sarah forgot to take her phone with her when she left for the store. It buzzed on the kitchen counter, and curiosity got the better of me. I know it was wrong, but at that point, I felt like I had no other choice. I opened her messages, and there it was, texts from someone named David. They weren't work-related, far from it. They were personal, intimate. My heart sank. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to process. Over the next few days, I watched her more closely. I noticed how she'd smile when a message came in, how she'd rush to leave the room when she got a call. It all made sense now. The late nights, the lies, the coldness. Sarah was having an affair. When I finally confronted her, there was no explosive argument, no yelling or screaming. I simply asked, "Who is David?" Her face went pale. She stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was too late. The damage was done. "I'm sorry, Alex," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." I stood there, stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had loved so deeply, the one I had built my life around, had betrayed me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask her how she could do this to me. But instead, I just felt numb. Sarah tried to explain, saying she had felt trapped in our marriage, that she didn't know how to tell me she was unhappy. But none of it mattered. The trust was broken, and there was no going back. We tried counseling, but it didn't help. Sarah had checked out of the marriage long before her affair started, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered heart. In the end, we divorced. It was painful, but it was the only option. I couldn't stay in a marriage where I was constantly questioning whether I was enough, whether I could trust her. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs sooner. Maybe I could have done something to save our marriage, or maybe it was doomed from the start. I don't know. All I know is that love isn't enough if there's no trust, no communication. After the divorce, things weren't easy for me. I moved out of the house, which I'd loved, because it was supposed to be our forever home. Every corner of it was filled with memories, both good and bad, and staying there would have been like living with ghosts. So I packed my things and found a small apartment across town, far enough to feel like I was starting fresh, but not so far that I had to completely uproot my life. The first few weeks after the split were the hardest. I couldn't escape the questions. What went wrong? Why didn't I see it coming? Was there something fundamentally wrong with me that drove Sarah into someone else's arms? Every quiet moment was filled with those doubts. I barely slept. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my mind racing, playing back every moment of our relationship, trying to pinpoint where things started to go wrong. I tried to stay busy. I threw myself into work, taking on more projects, working late, anything to avoid going home to the emptiness of that apartment. It helped to an extent. At least while I was busy, I didn't have to think about Sarah. But the moment I stopped, the loneliness crept back in. I remember one evening, a couple of months after the divorce, when I ran into Sarah at a grocery store. I wasn't expecting it, and neither was she. She looked surprised, almost guilty, when she saw me. I was standing by the produce section, staring blankly at some apples when she turned the corner. It was awkward, to say the least. We made small talk, the kind you have with an old acquaintance you haven't seen in years, not with someone you once planned a life with. "How have you been?" she asked, her voice cautious. I shrugged, taking it one day at a time. She nodded, biting her lip like she wanted to say something else but didn't know how to. I didn't have the energy for a real conversation, so I made up an excuse and left. As I walked out of the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had moved on. Maybe she was still with David. Maybe she wasn't. But the fact that I still cared bothered me. I didn't want to care. She had hurt me, and yet I was still thinking about her. It wasn't until I talked to a close friend of mine, Mike, that I began to see things a little more clearly. Mike and I had known each other since college, and he had been my rock through the whole ordeal. One night over beers, he gave me the tough love I needed. "Alex," he said, looking me dead in the eye, "you need to stop punishing yourself over this. You didn't make her cheat. You didn't make her lie. That's on her. You did everything you could to save that marriage." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. I had tried. Maybe I had been naive, but I wasn't to blame for Sarah's choices. It took me a long time to accept that, though. The guilt, the doubt, it had become a habit, a toxic one. I started seeing a therapist around that time. I wasn't really sure what I was hoping to get out of it, but I figured talking to someone might help. And it did. I began to realize that the end of my marriage, as painful as it was, didn't define me. It was a chapter, one that I had to close to move forward. I learned to forgive myself for not being able to fix everything. Some things can't be fixed. Some things just end, and that's okay. As the months went by, I started to find myself again. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I had neglected during my marriage, and focused on building a life that was just mine. Not ours, not hers, but mine. I took a photography class, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I went hiking more often, exploring places I had always meant to visit, but never did, because Sarah wasn't interested. Slowly but surely, I began to heal. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. I was at a coffee shop working on some emails when a woman approached me. She had kind eyes, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and a warm smile that instantly put me at ease. "Excuse me," she said, holding up a book. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading the same book as me." I looked down at my copy of The Alchemist and smiled. Great minds think alike, I guess. We ended up chatting for a while, talking about books, life, and everything in between. Her name was Emily. There was something about her. Maybe it was her kindness or her genuine interest in what I had to say. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. It wasn't like I was falling head over heels or anything like that, but I felt something I hadn't felt in ages. A connection. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I ran into each other a few more times at the same coffee shop. Each time, our conversations grew a little longer, a little deeper. I found myself looking forward to those moments, something I hadn't experienced since the early days of my relationship with Sarah. Eventually, I asked her out for dinner, and to my surprise, she said yes. We had a great time, and as the evening ended, I realized something important. I was ready to open up again, not necessarily to fall in love, but to let someone new into my life. For so long, I had been holding on to the pain of the past, afraid to move on. But sitting there with Emily, I realized that it was okay to start over. It was okay to hope again. Our relationship didn't blossom overnight. It was slow, cautious. I was still healing, still learning to trust again, and Emily understood that. She didn't push me, and for the first time, I felt like I was with someone who saw me for who I was, flaws and all. In time, I let go of the anger I had towards Sarah. I stopped blaming her, and more importantly, I stopped blaming myself. Some relationships aren't meant to last forever, and that's not a failure, it's just life. Sarah and I had our time, and while it ended badly, it taught me lessons I wouldn't trade for anything. I learned how to forgive, how to let go, and how to rebuild. After that first dinner with Emily, I found myself wondering what was next. I wasn't in a rush to figure everything out like I had been in the past. With Sarah, everything had moved so fast. We'd fallen in love quickly, gotten married, and built a life together at breakneck speed. But with Emily, things felt different. It was slower, calmer, more real in a way. There was no pressure to rush into something, and for the first time in my life, I appreciated the value of taking things one day at a time. We continued to see each other, coffee dates, dinners, weekend walks in the park, and slowly I found myself opening up more. At first, I had been hesitant to talk about my past with her. I didn't want to dump all my baggage on her so soon. But Emily, being the patient and understanding person she was, never pushed. She let me share things at my own pace, and eventually, I told her everything. One evening, as we sat by the river watching the sunset, I told her about Sarah, about the affair, about the divorce, about how broken I had felt afterward, how lost I had been. I expected her to be uncomfortable, maybe even pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she just listened quietly, nodding occasionally, letting me know she was there, really there. When I finished, she placed her hand on mine and said something I'll never forget. "Alex, you've been through a lot. But that doesn't mean you're broken. You're just human. We all have scars, but it's how we move forward that matters." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had seen myself as damaged, as someone who had failed at one of the most important relationships in his life. But in that moment, with Emily's quiet reassurance, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought. We continued to grow closer, and with each passing day, I felt myself healing in ways I hadn't even realized I needed. Emily brought a lightness into my life, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that she was kind or understanding. It was that she saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and accepted me without judgment. As we got to know each other better, I learned more about her past as well. Emily had been through her own struggles. She had lost her mother to cancer when she was in her early 20s, and the grief had shaped much of who she was. But instead of letting it harden her, Emily had chosen to embrace life with an open heart. She believed in living fully, in being present, in cherishing the small moments, because she knew all too well how fragile life could be. Her outlook on life was contagious. Being around her made me want to be better, not just for her, but for myself. I started to let go of the lingering bitterness I had towards Sarah. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the memories of what had happened still stung. But over time, I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. Sarah had moved on, and so should I. I remember one night, months into my relationship with Emily, when Sarah came up in conversation. We were at my apartment, curled up on the couch, watching a movie. During a quiet moment, Emily turned to me and asked, "Do you ever talk to her?" "Sarah?" I asked, surprised. "No, not since the divorce." "Why?" Emily shrugged. "Just curious. I was wondering if you ever got closure." I thought about it for a moment. Closure. It was something I had thought about a lot after the divorce. For a long time, I had wanted answers that Sarah couldn't or wouldn't give me. I wanted to know why she cheated, why she didn't fight for our marriage, why she let it fall apart without so much as a real explanation. But now, sitting there with Emily, I realized something important. "I don't think I need closure from her," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I've spent so much time trying to understand why things happened the way they did, but maybe it's not about getting answers from her. Maybe it's about accepting that sometimes things just end, and that's okay." Emily smiled, her eyes soft. "I think that's a really healthy way to look at it." And it was. For the first time, I felt like I didn't need Sarah's validation or an apology. I didn't need her to explain herself, because no explanation would ever fully heal the wounds she had left. Healing had to come from within me. I had to let go of the need to understand every detail of what had gone wrong and just accept that it had. Life moves forward, whether we want it to or not. As the months went by, Emily and I grew even closer. We took trips together, met each other's friends and families, and slowly started talking about the future. It wasn't like with Sarah, where everything felt rushed and frantic. With Emily, the future felt like something we could build together, piece by piece, at our own pace. There was a day, about a year after we started dating, that stands out to me. Emily and I were walking through a park on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves crunching under our feet. We weren't talking about anything in particular, just enjoying the day, when she suddenly stopped and looked at me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Alex," she said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about what we want." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Yeah? And what have you been thinking?" She smiled, a little shyly. I think I'm ready for more. For us to take that next step, whatever that looks like. I love you, and I want to build a life with you." Her words took me by surprise, not because I didn't feel the same, but because I hadn't realized just how ready I was for that next step, too. I hadn't allowed myself to think about the future in that way since Sarah, but now, with Emily standing in front of me, looking at me with such love and trust, I realized that I was ready. Ready to open my heart fully again, ready to take that risk. "I love you too, Emily," I said, my voice steady, "and I'm ready to build that life with you." It wasn't a grand, sweeping proposal, and there were no dramatic gestures. But in that quiet moment, I knew that my journey of healing had come full circle. I had gone from a broken man, struggling to understand the ruins of his marriage, to someone who had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, with the help of someone who truly saw him. The future wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I looked forward to. With Emily by my side, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, open, honest, and with the lessons of the past firmly behind us. Life with Emily unfolded in ways I never expected. After that autumn day in the park, we didn't rush into any big decisions. We simply continued to grow together, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't in a hurry. I'd learned that patience was key in a relationship. Emily and I took things slowly, savoring every moment, and it felt right. It was about a year and a half into our relationship when Emily and I decided to move in together. I remember that day vividly. We stood in her cozy apartment, surrounded by boxes and scattered furniture, laughing as we tried to figure out where everything would go. Moving in with someone always brings a mix of excitement and nervousness. You learn things about each other that you never noticed before, little quirks and habits that can either bring you closer or drive you mad. Emily was neat, organized in a way that put my bachelor-style living to shame. I was more of a throw-it-where-it-fits kind of guy. There were a few minor clashes at first, like when I left dishes in the sink for a bit too long, or when she rearranged my books in alphabetical order, which, I admit, actually made finding things easier. But those were small things, and we found ways to navigate them together. It wasn't about perfection, it was about compromise, about learning to live with each other's flaws and differences. One evening, after we had finished unpacking the last of the boxes, we sat down on the couch, exhausted but happy. The place didn't quite feel like home yet, but it was starting to. I looked over at Emily, her hair falling loose from the messy bun she'd tied up earlier, and I realized just how much my life had changed. "Do you ever think about the future?" I asked her, my voice soft in the dimly lit living room. Emily looked at me, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Of course. I think about it all the time. Why?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the thoughts swirling in my head. I had spent so much of my life afraid of the future, afraid of what it held after everything that had happened with Sarah. But now, with Emily, the future didn't seem so daunting anymore. "I guess I'm just happy," I said, feeling a little foolish for stating something so simple. For the first time in a long time, I'm not scared of what's next. I don't feel like I'm trying to fix something or fill a void. I'm just happy. Emily's smile widened, and she leaned over, resting her head on my shoulder. I'm happy too, Alex. More than I've been in a long time. We sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the soft hum of the city outside our window. The night felt peaceful, like the calm after a long storm. And in that moment, I realized just how far I had come from the man who had once felt so broken, so lost. I wasn't that person anymore, but life, as I'd learned, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few months after we moved in together, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in a long time, Sarah. It was a simple text, nothing dramatic or overly emotional, just, "Hey, Alex. It's been a while. I was wondering if we could meet up and talk." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave the past where it belonged. But another part of me was curious. What could she possibly want to talk about after all this time? I showed the message to Emily that evening. She read it, then looked up at me with a calm expression. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't feel like I need to talk to her. But at the same time, I kind of want to hear what she has to say. Does that make sense?" Emily nodded. "It does. Just remember, whatever you decide, I'm here." Her support meant the world to me, and after thinking it over for a few days, I decided to meet with Sarah. Not because I was looking for closure, I had found that within myself, but because I wanted to see where she was at, how she was doing, and maybe, in some small way, close the door on that chapter of my life for good. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one where we used to go during our early days together. Seeing Sarah again was strange. She looked different, older, more tired, like life had worn her down in ways I hadn't expected. There was an awkwardness between us, a tension that wasn't hostile, but wasn't quite comfortable either. "Thanks for meeting with me," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly, "but I figured we both deserved a chance to talk." Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee absently. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, Alex, for everything, for how I treated you, for how things ended. I know it's too late for apologies, but I needed to say it." Her words caught me off guard. I had imagined this conversation in so many different ways, but I hadn't expected an apology, not after all this time. "I appreciate that, Sarah," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But we both made mistakes. It wasn't all on you." She shook her head. "No, it was. I was the one who cheated. I was the one who gave up. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I could see the regret in her eyes, and it made me realize something important. Sarah wasn't the villain I had made her out to be in my mind. She was just a person who had made bad choices, who had been lost in her own way. "I've moved on," I said finally, my voice steady. "I've healed, and I hope you have too." She smiled sadly. "I'm trying. It's been hard, but I'm working on it." We talked for a little while longer, catching up on the basics of life: work, family, the usual stuff. But the conversation didn't linger on the past. There was no need to rehash old wounds. When we said goodbye, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. As I walked back to the apartment I now shared with Emily, I realized that the meeting with Sarah wasn't about closure. It wasn't about making peace with her. It was about making peace with myself, about acknowledging that the past, while painful, didn't define who I was anymore. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She looked at me with those warm, understanding eyes, and without a word, I knew she understood everything that had happened. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. "It went well," I said, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I think I can finally say goodbye to that part of my life. And I could. Meeting with Sarah hadn't reopened old wounds. It had allowed me to close them for good. I realized that the love I had once felt for her had faded into something else, something that was more about understanding and forgiveness than anything else. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Emily and I continued to build our life together. We talked about the future, about maybe getting a house, starting a family someday, but we weren't in a rush. We had learned that life doesn't always go according to plan, and that was okay. We were happy, and that was enough. One day, as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the sunset, Emily turned to me with a playful smile. "You know, Alex," she said, "I think we've got a pretty good thing going here." I smiled back at her, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, I think so too." And in that moment, I knew that everything, every heartache, every struggle, every painful lesson had led me to this point, to this life, to this love. Time passed quietly after that chapter with Sarah had finally closed. Emily and I settled into our new life with an ease I hadn't experienced before. It was as if, after years of turbulence and doubt, I had finally found the calm I had been searching for. We lived our days filled with laughter, companionship, and a deep sense of understanding that only comes when two people truly see each other for who they are. But life, as I had learned, was never a straight path. One evening, about a year after we moved into the house, I came home from work to find Emily sitting at the dining room table, staring at a letter in her hands. Her face was pale, and there was a heaviness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag by the door and walking over to her. "Everything okay?" Emily didn't answer right away. She just handed me the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. I unfolded it and read the first few lines. My heart sank. It was from the hospital, routine test results for Emily's checkup. But something had come back abnormal. They wanted her to come in for further testing. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said quickly, trying to put on a brave face. "Probably just a mistake. These things happen all the time, right?" But I could hear the fear in her voice. I could see it in the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. And in that moment, all the happiness, all the stability we had built together felt suddenly fragile. "We'll go together," I said, sitting down beside her, and taking her hands in mine. We'll figure this out. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, tests, and waiting. The waiting was the worst part. Every phone call, every email felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something we couldn't control. Emily tried to stay positive, but I could see the cracks in her armor. And for the first time since we'd been together, I felt helpless. I couldn't fix this. I couldn't protect her from what was coming. Then the news came. Cancer. It wasn't what we had expected, but there it was. The doctor spoke in calm, clinical terms, explaining the treatment options, the prognosis, the road ahead, but all I could hear was the word cancer echoing in my mind, drowning out everything else. Emily was quiet during the drive home. She stared out the window, her hands resting in her lap, and I didn't know what to say. What do you say when the person you love most in the world is facing something like that? When we got home, she went straight to bed. I followed her, sitting on the edge of the mattress, not sure if she wanted to talk or be alone. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke. "I'm scared, Alex." Her voice was small, and it broke something inside me to hear her sound so vulnerable, so unlike the strong, fearless woman I had fallen in love with. "I am too," I admitted, feeling the weight of those words settle between us. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, neither of us knowing what the future held. But one thing was certain. Whatever happened, we would face it together. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Emily started chemotherapy, and the side effects hit her hard. She lost weight, her hair, her energy. There were days when she could barely get out of bed, days when she was too sick to eat or even talk. It was heartbreaking to see her like that, this vibrant, full-of-life woman reduced to someone who had to fight just to make it through the day. But through it all, she never gave up. Even on her worst days, she would look at me with that same quiet determination and say, "We'll get through this." And I believed her. I had to, because the alternative was too painful to even consider. Our friends and family rallied around us, offering support in any way they could. My parents, who lived a few hours away, would come to help out whenever possible. Emily's sister, Katie, practically moved in with us during the roughest weeks, and having her there made a world of difference. But even with all the support, it was a battle we fought alone, in the quiet moments, behind closed doors, when it was just the two of us. There were nights when I would lie awake, listening to Emily's soft breathing beside me, and wonder if we would ever get our old life back. The life we had built together, full of hope and dreams for the future, now seemed like a distant memory. But then I would remember the promise I had made to her, that we would face this together, and I knew I couldn't let myself fall apart, not when she needed me to be strong. As the months went on, there were small victories. The treatments, though brutal, started to show signs of working. Emily's doctors were cautiously optimistic, and slowly she began to regain some of her strength. It was a long, grueling process, but she was a fighter, and bit by bit she started to come back to me. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden watching the flowers bloom, Emily turned to me with a tired but genuine smile. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again," she said softly. I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with relief. "I never doubted you for a second." She laughed, a weak but beautiful sound that I hadn't heard in far too long. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, we would make it through. We had already survived so much together, and I was ready to keep fighting for as long as it took. Months later, after what felt like an eternity, Emily went in for her final round of tests. The results were what we had been praying for: remission. The cancer was gone, and though the doctors warned us that there was always a chance it could come back, for now, we could breathe again. We could live again. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new beginning, a second chance at the life we had almost lost. As we sat on the porch of our home that evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, and smiled. "Yeah, we did." And in that quiet moment, I realized something. Life was never going to be perfect. It would always have its struggles, its heartbreaks, its challenges. But with Emily by my side, I knew we could face whatever came our way. Because love wasn't just about the good times. It was about standing together when things got hard, about choosing each other over and over again, no matter how tough the road became.